My presentation is more about Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is a new framework adopted in March on the 18th, 2015. And this can be used as an instrument for climate change adaptation. So, first of all, let me just express my appreciation to the organizers of this event for your kind invitation for us to be here to share information. And also, I would like to express that my appreciation to the host for this event, and everything actually arranged in a very professional manner, very smooth. So to start with, I would like to say it's also a great honor for me to be here to participate this APEC Climate Change Symposium 2015. My presentation will be complementary to the one Mr. Palmer just presented, which is focused on the Asia Pacific and also the Philippines case. So I would provide a global picture on disaster risk reduction. So together, we both cover global, regional, and national situation on disaster issues and how we can work together between the disaster risk reduction communities and the climate change communities. By working together, we can accelerate risk reduction and building resilience of our communities and countries. So my presentation will focus on three elements. The first element is why we do need a new international framework for disaster risk reduction. And the second is what are the key elements of the Sendai Framework and how we can use it as an instrument for climate change adaptation. From this slide, we can see it has been 25 years since the member states of the United Nations start to work together with a common objective to reduce risk and impact of disasters. In these 25 years, a lot has been done, among which I would like to just emphasize 3 points. As these 3 points was also the starting point for the consultation, preparation, and formulation of the Sendai Framework. The first point is our increased understanding of the fact that there are no natural disasters. All the disasters are man-made. This is simply because development is not disaster neutral. Development can either increase or decrease disaster risks. There is a close link among issues of disaster risk reduction, development, and climate change. The second point is that we have made a great progress in disaster management, especially in early warning and disaster preparedness. With this progress and success, we have seen in the past decade a downward trend in disaster mortality, especially in weather-related disasters. So this is a good news. We have less people actually lost their lives in disasters. But the challenge remains. So let's come to my third point, I would like to emphasize here. This is a disaster management approach. It does not fit for risk reduction or for risk management. And therefore, in the past decades, we have seen a trend of growing risks of people and economic assets. So that is, sorry that there is a key. This actually reflected the same situation in Asia and the Pacific. And this has been well underlined in Dr. Palmer's presentation and also in the background document or concept notes which the organizers has prepared for this very event. As we collectively failed to reverse the trend of growing risks of people and economic asset to disasters, so we are still live in a very risky world. Historical loss does not really give a good idea of the future risks of disasters. Most of the disasters that could happen have not yet happened. According to the Global Assessment Report 2015, and the world, especially in terms of economic assets, is still very risky. And disasters continue to be the major threat to the international community for achieving sustainable development. The average annual global losses per year are about $314 billion US dollars, excluding drought and agriculture. So if we add this, the impact on this is even bigger. The average annual loss is not what countries will lose per year, but rather here it emphasizes that countries should put aside to cover the future losses over the long term. So I should point out that this is not a map of human impact of disasters, but this is, normally for the human impact of disasters, the poor countries are often get the bigger share. But here is rather focused on the impact of disasters in economic and financial terms. That's why you can see the richer countries or countries with more population have to set aside more money and in order to cover the needs for the disaster recovery. So that because the value of what the economy actually is rather bigger than the poor countries. That's why you see, seems in Africa is less risky. Actually, that is not the case. You have to really understand that the map is not represented human impact of disasters, but rather in economic and financial terms. Similar situation for risk business. Just now we just over-package as countries as a whole. But here, if we take out the business community, the situation is no better than the one I just showed. The situation for business is similar because they have faced many different disaster risks. They risk losing their productive assets. For example, the direct losses from the 2015 flood in Thailand alone were $45 billion US dollars, or 60% of the country's annual investment. Business also risk losing profits due to the supply chain disruption. For example, the Toyota lost $1.2 billion US dollars due to the parts shortage following the 2011 East Japan earthquake. In addition, 150,000 fewer cars were produced in the United States, and there was also a 70% production drop in India and a 50% drop in China. This is all actually put together as a loss of the Toyota car company. All this was mainly due to a single critical factory who is making the microchips. So business now dependent on global supply chains, thus can suffer losses due to disaster which happened in the other side of the world. So the world is more than ever interconnected. So in other words, I want to echo the point which Mr. Palmer actually highlighted. We cannot work in silo. We need to work in collaboration. And in collaboration, we can come out with the best solutions to the challenges and problems we are facing. Above all, business risk, their future. Reputation suffers, skills workers leave, relationships with partners and suppliers also severely affected, and customers switch to competitors, and their market is lost. So after this, and the business actually is really suffer a comprehensive damage for the business continuity. Therefore, I give you an example. After the Kobe earthquake in 1985, many businesses left the city, and some never come back. And the port of Kobe fell from number 6 to number 47th in the world ranking of port between 1995 to 2010. So right after the earthquake, the port has never really come back to where they were, despite they have take a lot of measures and spent a lot of money to invest for its competitiveness. So this is really truly a threat to sustainable development. So to address this issue, with support of experts and people working in other areas like you, and actually come up with a kind of more clear concept with disaster risk management. To facilitate sustainable development, it means we have to change our approach to disaster risk management. The focus has to be moved from managing disasters to managing disaster risks. Risk which we embedding in our development path. Disaster risk and climate change are both dependent variables of development. Therefore, risk management aligns with 3 frameworks: the framework for disaster risk reduction, the framework for sustainable development goals, and the new framework for climate change, which I guess in December is going to be another new global guidance for climate change issues. So risk management now urgently needs to be mainstreamed in development systematically from step 1 to step Z. So before you decide to develop a concept of development, and you have to do the risk assessment first. So this has to be done systematically. Once the risk assessment, risk-informed development plan is approved, you have to integrate disaster risk management approach into the whole process of development projects. So therefore, successfully risk management needs to combine the 3 approaches of risk management in appropriate policies, strategies, and the development practices. So I would like to, after this event, please take a few minutes to study this slide. It can be very helpful, and to see how we, the disaster risk reduction community and the climate change community, can work together and help to actually promote the paradigm shift from managing disasters to managing risk through disaster risk management approach. So against this background, the understanding, the progress, the challenge, and the new approach, and the Sendai Framework was adopted at the 3rd World Conference in Sendai City. And this actually slide represents the key elements of the Sendai Framework. As you can see, it set one ambitious goal, and we explained it, why it's ambitious, and the outcome, and along with 7 global targets, 13 principles, and 4 areas of priority actions at 4 levels. To achieve the goal set, the Sendai Framework recognized the importance of the stakeholders' role and the need for international cooperation and global partnership. The Sendai Framework made the shift from disaster management to disaster risk management focus. We are also shifting from what to do to how to do them. And we are also shifting from considering different groups, such as women and the youth, in many places as victims and vulnerable, to agents for change. And how to do it? By focusing on their inclusion and empowerment. So we have to really empower them and to make them an agent for change in order to speed up the process of Sendai Framework implementation. The scope. The Sendai Framework actually adds slow onset, small scale, biological and other man-made hazards, in addition to disasters caused by natural, environmental, and technological hazards. The framework also increases the scope of action in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. And because reconstruction is a redevelopment process, so risk management is very important in order to avoid to build back the same risk at the same disaster-prone areas. The expected outcome of the Sendai Framework moves far beyond the past Hyogo Framework for Action, which was implemented in the past 10 years. It emphasizes the substantial reduction of disaster risk. This is quite ambitious because it is a challenge to reduce disaster risks. And also losses of lives, health, cultural assets of persons, business, communities, and countries. So you can see the first start with the unit, person, and then business and communities. So we start from where things matters for change. Without achieving these elements, it would be very difficult for us to talk about, not even to achieve sustainable development. So in other words, this will pave the way for us to achieving sustainable development. The goal of the Sendai Framework is very straightforward, aiming at risk prevention, risk reduction in order to achieve resilience. To achieve this goal, we need to change the way we do business in development and investment today. We need to manage disaster risk before, during, and after public development, as well as private investment through better governance and accountability system, so that the risk issues can be monitored from the very beginning to the end of the development projects. In order to achieve the goal set for the Sendai Framework, and the government for the first time agreed to set a set of global targets for disaster risk reduction. And this is a big step forward, reflecting the increased political commitment and the determination to address disasters and risks in our society. By 2030, governments, with support of the stakeholders and with the science support, aim to reduce disaster mortality, affected population, economic losses, and also damages to critical infrastructure, while working to increase the number of national and local strategies by disaster risk management. And this has to be done by 2020 in order to provide clear guidance and the roadmap to reduce disasters. So this is the first priority for our office to focus on in collaboration with national governments. International partnership and cooperation and availability and access to early warning and information and assessment. And these are the key elements of the global targets. I just want to say that the General Assembly has passed a resolution asking the United Nations to set up an open-ending working group among the experts who can represent their country's support to work together and to develop the indicators of these 7 targets. So the work already started. So now is the 13 guiding principles, and which underlined that the government has the primary responsibility to prevent and reduce disaster risks. However, the responsibility should be shared between local and the central governments, and also among the development sectors and the stakeholders. More effort should be made to promote the coherence between disaster risk reduction, climate change, and sustainable development. This reflects in policies, plans, practices, and mechanisms across different sectors and agendas. This is also true for engagement of all of society. We call it a whole of society approach. I remember in 2016, the Clinton actually the former President Clinton advocate disaster risk reduction is everybody's responsibility, every citizen's responsibility. So we need to empower the whole society, every citizen, in order to accelerate risk reduction and resilience building. And this is also very much true. We need to engage not only government, but also the legislative branch of government, so that our law legislation will be well in place to govern the behavior of development. And this framework, the Sendai Framework, has set 4 priority areas for action. The first one is understanding disaster risk, which requires policies actions should be formulated based on the true assessment of risk, of hazards, vulnerability, and the capacity within local and national context. The second is strengthening the governance for managing disaster risk, which requires government and stakeholders to develop clear plans, guidance, and coordination within and across sectors. It also requires enhanced transparency and accountability of policies, regulations, and resources for risk management. The third is to invest in disaster risk reduction for resilience, which requires both public and private sectors to conduct risk assessment before development or investment in order to prevent new vulnerability and risk from being created while efforts is ongoing to reduce the existing risk of disasters. The last priority area is to enhance preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery. Disaster preparedness is an area, as I mentioned, that most countries have done relatively well. It can be even better if we mobilize the stakeholders and empower them. Again, I think that Mr. Palmer's presentation has actually emphasized this point. Government is alone cannot do the job. You need support and you need a response from the people, from different stakeholders in order to make a successful case. So collaboration and cooperation are very important at all levels and among different groups. This is especially, I think, for the case of youth and women. And we really need to pay more attention to actually encourage them, empower them to be on the front line of disaster risk reduction. And the good practice have demonstrated worldwide that their role are crucial for effective disaster response, recovery, and also in disaster risk reduction in the recovery process. So building back better is not how it looks. It emphasizes that reconstruction has to be risk resilient, withstand the impact of disasters in the future. This is basically the last slide of the framework, monitoring. So we have target, we have goals, outcome, and also we have principles and targets, and we need to monitor it to see if we are really on track for the implementation of the Sendai Framework. And here we are actually divided into 4 levels. One is a global and regional, second is national and local, and then in addition is a voluntary contribution of stakeholders for their commitment in disaster risk reduction or in implementation of Sendai Framework. So here I would like to emphasize that the most important parts of the monitoring are of national and local action, because progress made with national and local level implementation of Sendai Framework will determine the level of risk resilience of societies. Therefore, national and local governments need to review their current status of national and local disaster risk management, against which national indicators for risk management can be well developed. Actually, this work is ongoing in Asia, and many countries start to pick up the subject and to review what has been done in disaster risk management from policy to actions, and try to see how they can actually develop a more responsive, risk-informed national policies, strategies, and also national indicators as well. So how we can actually make Sendai Framework an instrument for climate change adaptation? The recent adopted Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction stress that addressing climate change as one of the drivers of disaster risks. This represents an opportunity to reduce disaster risk in a meaningful and coherent manner. The Sendai Framework also provides provisions for the future integration of disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation through promotion of multi-hazard approach and investment in disaster risk reduction for resilience. Climate change is considered as a magnifier of overall disaster risk, both by increasing the magnitudes and also frequencies of some disasters, as well as by shifting some geographical weather patterns. So among the IPCC 8 key climate change risks, 5 of them are closely linked with natural hazards, such as storms, drought, and floods, for which tools and the knowledge and scientific measures of risk management can be immediately used for climate change adaptation efforts. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Just to try to see what are the tools and measures available for risk management, for vulnerability assessment, and for adapting, which can be used for adapting climate change at community level. So for this, we would like to emphasize 4 areas that climate change community and disaster risk reduction community can work together. The first is to promote the use of disaster risk management knowledge. And for this, we need to enhance governance for integrating disaster risk reduction in national adaptation plan. And to achieve this, we require a high-level political vision, political view, and the commitment which are essential to transition towards integrated, risk-resilient development. And also, strong institutional arrangements and coordination mechanisms are needed between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And there has been a lot of good practice there, and which can be used and immediately. And also, I think that it is important to take time, not immediately rush to action, but rather take a little bit of time to assess the current policy, institutional, and financial arrangement in order to identify the existing gaps and build the coherence in policy and action issues between the two communities. And scoping financial needs and involving Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Planning, as well as the ministry who is responsible for development cooperation from the very start of a planning process. This is essential to address the long-term financial needs. So these are the 4 areas which we can, 4 actions which we can take to enhance the governance for integrating disaster risk reduction into national adaptation plans. The second point I would like to emphasize is the information. And we also do need to enhance the sharing of information, and also making a use of the existing information knowledges in order to integrate disaster risk reduction into the national adaptation plans. For this, I think here are 3 elements which has been long used, sorry for the typo. Make use of the existing national and international disaster loss and disaster damage database. And this in 86 countries, if not more, have already established their database, which can be really used for analysis to develop the risk-informed adaptation plans. And second is built upon existing disaster information and early warning systems, and also develop a central and accessible knowledge management platform. I think here is not only central, but accessible is the key word here. And in order to serve the needs of different sectors. Very often we hear that people say there are a lot of information there, but not accessible. So therefore, we need to take extra efforts to enhance and to promote the access of different stakeholders to the information available. By sharing the information, we also invite cooperation and collaboration among stakeholders. This is the third areas I would like to focus on is a preparatory element for integrating disaster risk reduction into national adaptation plans. For this, we really want to emphasize the action should start with a risk assessment. Not just is a risk assessment really based on the data and information available, and through the scientific approach. Not just get together and have a little bit of brainstorming and formulate, a kind of a plan. And that kind of plan will not be effective. And it's also a waste of resources, both human resources and financial resources, because the result would not be effective. So therefore, the risk assessment is a first step. And we need to be clear about the purpose of risk assessment and the end users and the needs from the start, and their needs from the start. And define the climate-related hazards and consider their interaction within a broader risk context. So in this way, I think that the risk assessment will be much more credible. Based on the risk assessment, we need to select adaptation options. For this, I think that both the disaster risk reduction community and the climate change community need to work together to carry out a joint exercise to identify adaptation measures, including DRR stakeholders, as I said, and identify the overlap and the complementarities between adaptation and disaster measures, and avoid the maladaptation and unplanned additional risk through sharing of information between the climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. This actually is the key element for two communities to working together. By doing this exercise, we understand each other's roles and responsibilities, and also make our work more complementary instead of competing with the existing resources. Sometimes we just use a different terminology. For us, we use disasters. Maybe for the international climate change community, you use extreme events. So that is extreme flood, extreme cyclones, extreme, the extended drought. So it's just to see how we can work together by start interacting, by start to do the risk assessment together and choose adaptation options. The last one, in order to make this happen, we need to develop implementation strategies to facilitate the integration of disaster risk reduction into national adaptation plans. This kind of strategy needs to strengthen the policy and the institutional framework to enable climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction interact to each other, these two communities. And also to finance and incentivize the risk reduction initiatives. And also to foster the partnerships and create a shared value for resilience. This will lead to a more sustainability to the results of resilience building. So I think that in addition to this is just some of the areas I would like to emphasize. One is a policy issue, and second is the financing issue, and third is a partnership. But more importantly, we need to actually monitor the process, and we need to report the process, and we need to review this process together. So slowly, I would like to see more and more the two communities start to merge together to pilot big-scale projects to actually reduce the impact of weather-related disasters. Again, I think the key words I want to emphasize is coherence, because this year, 2015, is a very unique year. In this year, we will see three important international frameworks. The first one is done. It's called Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. It's lasted 15 years, from 15 to 2030. And the second one, also adopted, is a Sustainable Development Agenda goals, and with 17 focus areas. And that is also adopted by the Head of States Summit in New York. And the next one is climate change, the COP 21, right? Which is going to be held in Paris. And I understand that all these will come up with a new agreement and new frameworks among the member states of the United Nations, basically cover all the countries on Earth. And this actually framework has provided a great opportunity for us to work together and to enhance the coherence coherence in policy making, and the coherence in program implementation. Only by enhancing the coherent actions, and we can accelerate disaster risk reduction and climate change mitigation and adaptation, and to achieve sustainable development. I'm saying this, probably you still remember my first slide. There are 3 levels. In the middle is a disaster risk reduction process, but on the top is the MDG towards SDGs, and the lower there is a climate change process. These 3 processes are very closely linked. Right now, if you examine the 3 frameworks in the sustainability development goals, where they emphasize the importance for risk reduction or risk management. And similarly, in climate change communities, especially IPCC, even had a report on these disaster-related issues. So I would really urge everyone, from the scientists to the government, and from central governments to the local governments, have an open mind and try to pilot some activities. And from drought management to flood management to the cyclone risk management. So a lot of tools, a lot of knowledge actually produced by experts and scientists, and now I think it's time for action. And with this, I would like to just say thank you very much for your attention.